Let's get started with grains. Grain is the staff of life. The word staff conveys support, that which props or upholds. This is what supports life. In Webster 1828 dictionary, it says, bread is the proverbial staff of life. That is a direct quote from the dictionary. I found that to be so interesting in my studies that even back then, grain was considered the staff of life. God says in verses 16 of D&C that all grain is good for the food of man. There isn't much that you can dispute there. In verse 17, he specifically says that wheat is for man and also all other grain. Now, there is a lot of talk and even studies that show that grain, specifically wheat, is bad for our bodies. So many believe that this part of the word of wisdom perhaps no longer applies because wheat has been genetically modified and it's not the same wheat that God was referring to in the word of wisdom. So why have things changed since the word of wisdom was written? Maybe it's another unfortunate circumstance of those conspiring men in the last days. Here's the thing. They really haven't changed wheat. At least not enough that we need to worry about, because if you remember in verse 2, he states that the word of wisdom is the order and will of God in the temporal salvation of all saints in the last days. Now, when you're thinking about saints in the last days, we are a little bit more last days than those in the time of Joseph Smith, are we not? It was given for all of us. I clearly understand circumstances such as wheat allergies or celiac disease, but if you happen to be on the gluten-free wagon, there isn't any benefit to being gluten-free. It isn't healthier, and it may lead to weight loss. More than anything, though, the weight loss is due to limiting processed foods that contain gluten, which are almost all of them. Companies and people love to pair wheat with salt, sugar, and fat. So you can see how going gluten-free might be beneficial for health and weight loss in that case, but it is not because of the gluten. Now, there are many grains beyond wheat, and God says that they are all good for us. So if you prefer to stay away from meat, then by all means, try something else. Enjoy some millet with its mildly delicious nutty flavor, or some brown rice, some barley, wild rice, teff, farro, sorghum, buckwheat. There are so many options and they are all good for us. Grains are higher in carbohydrates than any other food. Now, I may refer to grain as carbohydrates often in this course because grains are the number one source of carbohydrates in our diet. So please, when I say carbohydrates, don't think of donuts or white bread or anything like that. The truth is, all plants contain high amounts of carbohydrates, but grains happen to contain the most. So we are going to talk about carbs for a bit here and why they should be considered the staff of life. Carbohydrates have always been the number one source of energy for our bodies. Our own saliva produces enzymes that start to break down carbohydrates before it even enters the stomach, as if we were made to eat them. We are often fearful of eating carbs because we have been told they make you fat. Actually, when we eat carbs, they are stored in our body, our cells, as glucose and glycogen. These are our first source of energy whenever we need it. They are not stored as fat, despite what society may say. Now, there is one caveat to that, depending on the processing they have gone through. And that may be the key there. If they are processed, then they may be stored as fat. These processed carbohydrates I am referring to are also called simple carbohydrates. These carbohydrates, these simple carbohydrates, have been stripped of their fiber and most of their nutrients so that they are mostly protein and starch. They usually start with the word white. White sugar, white flour, white rice. These are those that can end up being stored as fat. I don't think God intended for us to eat carbohydrates in this manner, especially when he wrote the Word of Wisdom. Now, in the days of Joseph Smith, every community had a mill, and everyone would take their wheat or corn or whatever to the mill to have it freshly ground. This was called low milling, and it was usually done with stones. In low milling, every part of the wheat kernel was ground together. Once the fat in the wheat was exposed to the air, though, oxidation would occur, making it go bad fairly quickly. Around 1910, steel roller mills took over as the main mill. These turned milling into more of like a factory thing, and the community mills were no longer needed. One thing that roller mills do very efficiently is they separate the bran and the germ, the healthiest parts of the wheat, from the endosperm, which becomes the white flour, which includes starch, protein, and some fat. This made a fabulously fluffy bread and a flour that could store for very long periods of time. However, new diseases also began to appear that had never been seen before. These diseases were dangerous, and it was discovered that they came from vitamin deficiencies due to the germ and bran being taken out of the wheat. So the government began requiring that roller mills put these vitamins, of which there's 4 or 5, back into the bread, calling it enriched. Now, if you ask me, enriched sounds like a great word, but in this case, we are really being cheated. By taking out the bran and the germ from the bread, we're actually being cheated of 40 to 50 vitamins, minerals, and phytochemicals, not just 4 or 5. Another problem these roller mills had was that the flour, after it would sit, would begin to turn yellowish due to the nature of oxidation of fat. How did they combat this? They started putting bleach in the flour, and that's what makes up our current enriched white flour that we eat today. I don't think this is the type of wheat that God intended for us. However, 80 to 90% of the carbs people eat in America are refined, just like this, missing 70 to 90% of vitamins, minerals, and phytochemicals that happen to be the building blocks of our personal temple. Diets rich in refined carbohydrates, especially added sugars, can cause obesity, overweight, overeating, fatty liver, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, high cholesterol, and triglycerides, and heart disease. When I think about how grains themselves have changed, I think about John chapter 6, verse 35, where Christ says, I am the bread of life. Why would Christ call himself the bread of life, the staff of life, if this was somehow unhealthy for us? Is the bread that he offers where we never hunger or thirst, is it enriched, processed, or refined, separated into portions that provide little nutritional value? Why would Christ, the creator of this world, who creates these plants, who understands our anatomy, our sicknesses, why would he refer to himself as bread if it weren't something we were meant to eat? Speaking spiritually and nutritionally, we were meant to have the whole grain, not just a portion. And just like the bread that Christ refers to himself having, we should partake of the whole thing and not separate out the parts that we do not prefer, only to enjoy the fluff that does almost nothing for us. Grain is good for man. I know the keto diet is very popular right now because of the short-term weight loss aspect that has been attributed to it. However, people don't talk about how detrimental this diet can be to your health. The keto diet is a diet very low in carbohydrates. Science many times over has shown that low-carb diets are detrimental to our health. They're linked to heart disease, stroke, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, shorter lifespan, cancer, constipation, headaches, muscle cramps, fatigue, poor gut bacteria, inflammation, insulin resistance, decreased cognitive function, type 2 diabetes, osteoporosis, and other effects on bone health, poor kidney function, gallbladder issues, lack of concentration, bad breath, weight gain, obesity, fatty liver disease, overeating, infertility, metabolic syndrome, high triglycerides, chronic inflammation, and probably many more that I missed. But is that list not long enough to want to stay away from that kind of diet? Low carb diets just don't work. These are some studies just to show you. This one says heart arrhythmias, cardiac contractile function impairment, sudden death, osteoporosis, kidney damage, increased cancer risk, impairment of physical activity, and lipid abnormalities are all linked to long-term restriction of carbohydrates in the diet. Kidney problems. Low carbohydrate diets can be dangerous. It says right there in this study. There's serious potential health aspects to low carb diets. And the list just goes on. I'm going to stop there. The list just keeps going on. So, this is something that I found very interesting in my studies. It says that grain is a staff of life for really all animals. So how is grain the supporting role in carnivorous animals? Verses 14 and 17 mentions animals a lot more than we would expect. Verse 14 says, all grain is ordained for the use of man and of beasts to be the staff of life, not only for man, but for the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air and all wild animals that run or creep on the earth. Nevertheless, wheat for man, and corn for the ox, and oats for the horse, and rye for the fowls and for swine, and for all beasts of the field, and barley for all useful animals, and for mild drinks, and also other grain. It makes sense, I suppose, that this would refer specifically to farm animals like the horse, the ox, pigs, birds, the beasts of the field, but what of all the wild animals like those mentioned in verse 14? If they have the ability to eat grain, why don't they? Joseph Smith, who was known for not killing animals and not eating meat, said, how will the serpent ever lose his venom while the servants of God possess the same disposition and continue to make war upon it? Men must become harmless before the brute creation. And when men lose their vicious dispositions and cease to destroy the animal race, the lion and the lamb can dwell together, and the sucking child can play with the serpent in safety. Brigham Young also taught this by saying, let the people be holy, and the earth under their feet will be holy. Let the people be holy and filled with the Spirit of God, and every animal and creeping thing will be filled with peace. The more purity that exists, the less is the strife. The more kind we are to animals, the more will peace increase, and the savage nature of our brute creation will vanish away. You see, in the Garden of Eden, there was no prey or predator. All were created equal and ate of the good things in the garden. It was only once sin was introduced that animals began to prey on each other, and we upon them. In Isaiah chapter 11, verses 6 through 9, we learn that when Christ reigns again and sin is taken from the world, the same thing will happen. Animals will no longer prey upon each other. In this verse, he says, the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. And the cow and the bear shall feed. Their young ones shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. And the sucking child shall play on the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the cockatrice's den. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be filled of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. When Christ comes, all animals, even the carnivorous animals of the world, will be using grain as the staff of life.